"Looks like you need to cool off, Missy. This is a dive tank, not a filing cabinet." He said it loud enough for the far wall. That was the point. Staff Sergeant Barrett Vollmer had been running the second week of the Marine Combatant Diver course for 6 years, and he had learned early that a sentence only counted if the whole deck heard it. Then he put his shoulder into her. It was not a shove. A shove is honest. This was a step and a turn, and 190 pounds arriving through a shoulder. The way a man moves a door he has decided is in his way. The clipboard went first. She went second. 15 feet of water at 81 degrees took her without complaint. 22 students stood along the wall in wetsuit bottoms with their arms crossed. Half of them laughed. They laughed because he had laughed first. And at 0600 on a Gulf Coast dive deck, in the second week of the hardest course any of them had ever attempted, you laughed at whatever the man with the clipboard-shaped grudge laughed at. The deck was concrete, wet from the hose down, sloped 4 degrees to the drains. Behind the 15-foot instructional tank stood the tower, a column of water, 38 feet deep with viewing ports down one side, like the windows of a sunken train. To the left, the dive locker's roll-up door half open. Beside it, the gas analysis bench with its rack of 22 aluminum cylinders staged in 2 rows. Above all of it, a steel catwalk. Under the surface, she did not fight. That was the first thing. A person who falls into water fights it. They reach for the surface with their hands, and they hold the breath they were holding when they went in. And they come up loud and angry, and 8 seconds later than they should have. She exhaled the whole way down, a thin, continuous string of bubbles from the corner of her mouth, unbroken, metered, still going when her feet found the bottom. She landed on them. She turned once, not toward the light, toward the ladder. And she went to the ladder along the floor and came up the rail hand over hand with her chin down. 14 seconds. No splash on the way in, none on the way out. She stood on the deck in a soaked gray polo with a training command visitor badge clipped at the collar, still facing forward, water running off her elbows onto the concrete and finding the drains. She bent, picked up the clipboard, and shook it once. The pages were laminated. Somebody on the wall stopped laughing when they noticed that. Vollmer gave her 30 seconds. He was good at 30 seconds. He explained, at volume, what a dive deck was and who belonged on it, and what happened to people from headquarters who came down here with their little forms and their little checkboxes to grade men who did the actual work, and how the water was an honest judge, and how it had just rendered a verdict. She gave him 4 words. "Understood, Staff Sergeant." He read it as surrender. He was not entirely wrong about the sound of it. He was entirely wrong about the shape. Gunnery Sergeant Ronan Pelletier, Chief Instructor, 38 years old, 14 years in, 11 months from a retirement. He thought about the way other men think about a woman, stood 6 feet away, and looked at his boots, and said nothing at all. Lance Corporal Alonzo Amado, 21, laughed the loudest of anyone on the wall. He was failing. He had been told he was failing at 1900 the night before. A man who is drowning on land will laugh at anything that is not him. On the catwalk, Master Diver Senior Chief Rowan Longmire watched. Longmire was 48 and had run that dive locker for 19 years. He had pulled 11 unconscious men out of that tower with his own hands, and he had pulled 2 out who did not start again. He had spent 2 decades learning exactly one subject, which was what water does to people, and he had reached the point in that education where he no longer watched the water at all. He watched the person. He noticed 3 things. She blew the whole breath. Nobody does that by accident. An untrained body holds air like a purse it is afraid to lose. A trained one dumps it, because a body full of air at 15 feet is a body that fights the bottom, and the bottom is where the ladder is. She found the ladder before she found the surface. and she came up on a rhythm. Hand, hand, hand. On a count. The same interval each time. The way a man climbs an anchor line when the surface is a thing you earn instead of a thing you lunge for. Longmire wrote none of it down. He put both hands on the catwalk rail, and he stopped watching the class. Panic makes noise. She had not made any. Below him, Volmer turned back to 22 Marines with the satisfied face of a man who has settled something, and started the morning brief, and had no idea that the only person on that deck who had spent 19 years learning what the water tells you had just quit watching the students entirely. She was on the deck again at 0650 with a dry polo and the same laminated clipboard. Volmer noticed and decided not to notice. That was its own kind of statement, and the class read it correctly. The clipboard was furniture now. Furniture gets walked around. She walked the gas bench. 22 aluminum 80s staged in 2 rows, valves out, each with an analysis sticker on the shoulder. Percentage, date, time, initials of the safety observer who ran the analyzer and signed for the mix. It is the most boring piece of paper in diving. It is also the only thing standing between a man and a bottle that will quietly kill him. She read all 22. It took her 9 minutes. She did not touch a single valve. At bottle 11, she stopped. 21%. Air, 0515. Initials. Beside the bench, the analyzer itself sat in its case with its paper log tape hanging out of the slot the way it had hung for 11 years, because the school had never replaced the machine and nobody had ever needed it to be modern. She read the tape. 0452, 0501, 0509, 0522. There was no 0515. Across the deck, Amato had bottle 11 on his back and was 2 steps from the tower ladder with his fins in his hand. She crossed 30 feet of wet concrete without hurrying, which is a thing very few people can do, and put her palm flat on the tank valve and said 6 words. Stop. That bottle was never analyzed. Amato froze because a hand on your valve is a language every diver learns in week 1. Volmer arrived at volume, and she did not argue with him. She held out the analyzer. He almost didn't take it. 22 Marines were watching. That was the thing about running a deck by performance. The audience you build to witness your authority is the same audience that witnesses everything else. He took the analyzer. He cracked the valve and let the gas run across the sensor, and the numbers on the little display settled the way they always settle, drifting down and catching. 15.4% oxygen. A hypoxic trimix bottle, blended for depth, racked in the training bay in the wrong row. At 40 feet, it would have breathed fine. That is the cruelty of it. It would have breathed sweet and easy all the way down and all the way through the evolution. And then, on the swim out, in the shallows, at the moment the pressure came off, and the partial pressure of oxygen in that mix fell below what a brain requires. It would have taken his lights out somewhere between the surface and the ladder, with a safety swimmer 40 feet away, and a laughing class on the wall. 15.4. 0.2% from a number that would have made it a fatality instead of a story. Nobody laughed. The deck went the specific kind of quiet that happens when 22 young men do arithmetic at the same time. Amato did not move for a long moment. He stood with an aluminum cylinder on his back and his fins hanging from one hand, and looked at the analyzer display the way a man looks at a road he did not take. And then he looked at the water, and then at nothing. Somebody in the second rank said quietly, "That's the shallow bottle." It was not the shallow bottle. It had been racked in the shallow row, which is a different thing. And the difference between those 2 sentences is the whole discipline. A cylinder does not know where it is standing. It knows only what was put inside it. And the only way a man learns what is inside it is if somebody, at some point, in a boring room, ran a machine and told the truth about the number. She reached over and turned bottle 11 a quarter turn so the sticker faced out, where 22 people could read it. She did not say a word about it. She did not have to. Vollmer handed the analyzer back and said the word, "Fill station," 3 times in 90 seconds. He pulled bottle 11, walked it to the corner, and turned it valve down against the wall. He told the class it was a supplier error, and that this was exactly why they analyzed, which was a remarkable sentence for a man holding a sticker signed at a time the machine had never run. In the daily training log, in his own hand, he wrote, "Equipment swap. No impact to training." She photographed the page from waist height without changing her expression. Then she handed the analyzer hose back to the bench, and she coiled it before she set it down. 3 loops. Even. Tail tucked through the last loop and pulled snug, so the hose would not walk off the bench, and so the next man could take it in one motion. Longmire was leaning in the roll-up door, with a mug of coffee he had not drunk any of. He waited until she came past him, and he asked it flat. No preamble. "Where'd you learn to coil a hose?" "I read a lot," she said. "Civilians dropped the tail." She kept walking. He stood in the doorway of a dive locker he had run for 19 years and did arithmetic he did not like about a woman who had found the one bad bottle in a rack of 22 by reading a piece of paper and comparing it to another piece of paper, which is a thing no auditor does, because auditors check that the sticker exists. Divers check that the sticker is true. By day 3, she had a name. Clipboard. It moved through the class the way a name moves through 22 men who sleep in the same bay, instantly, then permanently. Corporal Blaise Mazur, 23, started it in the chow line, and by the evening brief, it was in the group chat. And by the second evening, the chat ran on almost nothing else. Clipboard's counting our laps again. Clipboard wrote something down. Everybody act natural. Bet she's writing down that a motto can't tie a knot. Vollmer never used it. He didn't have to. He let it exist, which is a different skill and a more useful one. On day 4, he hand-lettered a sign and taped it to the dive locker door. Authorized dive personnel only. No exceptions. He announced it to the deck without saying her name, which meant he said her name in the only way that mattered. Paperwork doesn't go in the locker. Paperwork goes where paperwork lives. She wrote the sign's posting time in the corner of a laminated page. The published training day ended at 1700. At 1930, under the tower lights, Vollmer ran a weighted underwater knot-tying evolution for 11 divers. It was not on the schedule. It was not in the program of instruction. It was, he told them, what separates divers from swimmers. And 11 exhausted men in their second week believed him, because at that point in that course, they would have believed almost anything said with enough certainty. The published minimum was 1 safety swimmer for every 4 divers in the water. He had 1 for 11. Or she sat in the bleachers in the dark, 30 feet up and 40 feet back, where the tower lights turned the water into a green window and the deck into shadow. She held a dive watch in her left hand, and she did not look at it the way a person checks the time. She read it. Elapsed. Interval. Elapsed. Interval. 11 divers. 1 safety swimmer. 94 minutes. She wrote it down. Around 2100, Amato came up the bleacher steps with his towel around his neck, and his hand shaking from 90 minutes of cold and failure. He found the shape of her in the dark, and he stopped. And everything that had been done to him that week came out at the only person on that deck standing below him. "You gonna write me up, Clipboard? Go ahead." His voice cracked in the middle, and he hated it. "Write me up. Write down that I'm garbage. Everybody else already did." She looked at him for 2 seconds. Not tonight. He waited for more. There wasn't any. He went down the steps loud, Because loud is what you have when you are 21. If you have ever stood in a room where everyone had decided who you were before you opened your mouth, and you had to stand there and take it, because saying the true thing would have cost more than the lie did, you already know what the next part of this feels like. Stay with her. Subscribe to Honor Tales, because this is the exact point where most people give up, and she doesn't. 11 divers in the water, 1 safety swimmer on the deck, and a woman in the bleachers writing down a time that was going to end a career, and not one man in that tank knew that the tank was being counted. Vollmer had been in the Marine Corps long enough to know that a problem you cannot shove into a pool, you write into a corner. He wrote the report at 2100 on day 4 and submitted it at 2210. It was good. That was the thing about him that people underestimated, because he was loud. He was not stupid. He was practiced. Every physical fact in it was true. She had placed her hand on a student's cylinder valve. She had handled a piece of life support equipment. She had interrupted a training evolution in progress. She held no diving qualification recognized by that command. She had photographed a training log, every fact true, every meaning inverted. The woman who found the hypoxic bottle became, on 2 pages of clean prose, the reason there had been a problem at the gas bench. Pelletier read it at 22:30 in the instructor office with the door open. He knew 3 sentences in it were lies. He knew them the way you know your own hallway in the dark. He read it twice, and he thought about 14 years, and about a daughter starting her 2nd year at a school he had not expected to afford, and about 11 months. He signed as endorsing staff non-commissioned officer. Longmire was standing in the doorway when he did it. "It's his deck, Senior," Pelletier said to the desk. "It's the Navy's water," Longmire said, and left. At 0700 the next morning, Brannigan's visitor badge was downgraded at the quarterdeck by a lance corporal who apologized twice and had no idea why. Deck access revoked pending administrative review. Observation from the glass only. She was escorted to the observation window that ran along the west wall of the tower bay. She timed the walk. 240 feet, 91 seconds at the pace the escort set. Then she timed the safety swimmer's path from the deck chair to the tower ladder. 19 seconds. Then she timed the safety swimmer's actual path, which was not from the chair, because the chair was empty during the first evolution, and the safety swimmer was in the locker getting coffee. 51 seconds. She wrote all 3 numbers down, and then, from behind 2 inches of glass, with no access, no authority, and a report with her name on it, moving up a chain toward a board, she finally saw the whole shape of the thing. Because a man who behaves one way when a stranger is on his deck behaves another way when the stranger is behind glass. She watched Vollmer hold 2 students under past the published limit on a breath-hold evolution, counting on his fingers where the class could see, turning it into theater. She watched a 3rd man surface early with a flat hand, held out and rocked side to side. The signal every diver on Earth learns for something is wrong. And she watched Vollmer point at the bottom and send him back down. She counted 17 seconds between the signal and the descent. She wrote that down too. The glass was the coldest place in the building. The air handler ran along that wall, and the observation bay stayed at 68 degrees, while the deck stayed at 90. And she stood in a damp polo for 4 hours and did not move except to write. She learned the rhythm of him. Vollmer performed hardest in the first 20 minutes of an evolution and the last 5. In the middle, he went to the instructor office and left the deck to a corporal. She timed it. 19 minutes on day 5, 24 on day 6. Twice during those absences, a student surfaced and hung on the ladder for a full minute, with nobody watching him, but a woman behind 2 inches of glass, with no way to reach him, and no authority to send anyone who could. That was the part she wrote down twice, in 2 different places, in case one of the pages was ever taken from her. By the end of that morning, she had no access, No recognized authority in that building, and a formal complaint against her name. She also had 41 photographs, 9 timed evolutions, and 6 days. The arithmetic would not close, and when the arithmetic would not close, Rowan Longmire went looking. That was the whole of his method, and it had taken him 19 years to trust it. He pulled 16 weeks of dive logs and laid them beside 16 weeks of analyzer tape and chamber records on the long steel table in the back of the locker, and he stayed until 0100. 2 entries stopped him. Week 7. A student transported to the recompression chamber. Log entry. Precautionary. Week 11. A student transported to the recompression chamber. Log entry. Precautionary. Precautionary is a real word. It is also the word you write when you do not want to write the other word. Both chamber logs recorded the same treatment table. It was not a precautionary table. It was the table you run on a man who came up too fast with a head full of gas and stopped making sense on the deck. Then he checked signatures. The safety observer block on 9 separate evolutions carried the initials of a petty officer who had been on leave for 11 days across 2 of those dates. The initials were identical on all 9, not similar, identical, in the way that only happens when one hand writes them all. He photographed the tag board in the locker, every regulator, every maintenance tag, every date. And he started a log of his own in a green notebook he kept in his truck. At dusk, he found her on the seawall behind the chamber bay, where the school's ground ran out into the bay, and the water went from green to gray. He sat down uninvited. She was watching a shrimp boat make the channel. Every 4 minutes, she read the dive watch on her left wrist. Not glanced. Read it, the way a man reads a bottom timer, with her thumb finding the bezel first. He let 3 of those intervals go by. "You count," he said. She didn't answer. Everybody who counts learned it somewhere expensive. The boat cleared the channel marker. She let it get most of the way to the bridge before she said anything. 9 of your safety observer signatures were written by 1 person, she said. 2 of your precautionary chamber rides were not precautionary. He was quiet for a while. How long have you known that? Since Tuesday. And you did what with it? Wrote it down. Longmire put his forearms on his knees and looked at the water, and when he spoke again, it was in the voice a man uses when he is offering someone a door. "I've been here 19 years, he said. "I've seen 4 instructors like him. Every one of them went down eventually. Every one of them took at least 1 person with them on the way. You've got a complaint filed on you and a downgraded badge and no friends in that building." He turned his head. "If you're who I'm starting to think you are, walk away. Let the system do it slowly." She stood up and brushed the concrete dust off the back of her trousers. "Slowly is how people drown, Senior Chief." She walked the seawall back toward the transient quarters, and Longmire watched her go, and noticed the last thing he needed to notice. The boards on that seawall were uneven, 3 of them lifted by roots, and she did not break stride for any of them. Her cadence did not change. She had already measured them on the way out. He went back to the locker. He did not ask her name. He photographed the tag board a second time, with the date stamp on, and locked the images in a folder on a card he kept in his shirt. Something is about to happen on that deck that cannot be written away, and the man who does it is going to do it with his own hands at 4 in the morning. Subscribe to Honor Tale so you're here when he does. The next 12 hours are the reason this story exists. 2 men were now keeping records on the same deck. Only one of them knew what the other one was. Transient quarters. Room 14, 2300. Block walls painted the color of an aspirin. A duffel on the floor, unpacked to the depth of 4 days. On the back of the door, a garment bag that had not been opened since she arrived. Inside it, a service uniform. On the shoulders, the gold oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel. Above the left pocket, a ribbon rack she had not looked at in 3 years, and on it, second from the top, a bronze star with a bronze combat V for something that happened in 2014 that she had never once described out loud to a person who had not been there. On the desk, in a plain manila envelope, orders. Lieutenant Colonel D. Brannigan, USMC, will report and assume duties as officer in charge, Marine Combatant Diver Course, effective 27 July 2026. She had arrived 6 days early with a visitor badge and a clipboard, and she had done it on purpose because she had been a student on that deck in 2012, and she knew exactly what a course looks like when it knows it is being watched by the person who is about to own it. She wanted to see it the way the students saw it. She had seen it. Her name was Delphine Brannigan. She was 41 years old. She had been commissioned in 2007 at 22, deployed at 24, and had qualified as a combatant diver in 2012 at 27. In that tower, in that water, 40 feet down in the same green light those 22 Marines swam in every morning. Her call sign was Undertow. And the reason she could not walk away, the reason she had come 6 days early instead of 6 days late, was a man named Ignatius Cormier. 2016. A subsurface infiltration off a coast that has never been named in an unclassified document. Black water. Not dark. Black, the kind where your own hand at 8 inches is a rumor, where the world is a compass board glowing green in front of your face, and a count in your head, and a shoulder touching yours every few kicks to prove you have not been left alone in the ocean. Sergeant Iggy Cormier had been at her right shoulder for 4 years. He had a laugh that carried underwater as a kind of thump. He had taught her to coil a hose with the tail tucked, in that same dive locker, in 2012, when she was a student, and he was a second-year instructor, and he had told her that a hose that walks off a bench is a hose that finds a boot at exactly the wrong moment. At 41 feet, his rebreather flooded. There is no drama in it when it happens. That is what nobody understands. A rebreather does not explode. It gets heavy, and it gets wet, and it starts giving a man seawater where his air used to be, and the man breathes it once because his body cannot tell the difference in the half-second it has to decide. She had 11 seconds. She used 4. She dumped her own weight belt. She got his mouthpiece out of his teeth with 2 fingers, because that is the only way it comes out when a man is convulsing, and she got her own second stage in and held it there with her palm across his jaw. And then she brought him up. 9 meters a minute. 30 feet a minute. No faster, because faster is a bubble in an artery, and faster kills 2 people instead of 1. And every cell in her body was screaming at her to go straight up into the air. She held 9 meters a minute with a dying man on her regulator, because going faster would have killed them both. That is the sentence that ends most people. It did not end her. It rewrote her. They surfaced at 4 minutes and 20 seconds. She got him onto the deck of a boat that was rolling in a 4-foot chop, and she worked on him for 31 minutes with 2 other men. And at some point in the second half of that, the thing she was working on stopped being Iggy Cormier and became a body she was refusing to put down. The Board of Inquiry found no fault. Equipment failure. Nothing in her actions contributed. They wrote it in 1 paragraph. She did not believe the paragraph. Not because it was false, because it was insufficient. A paragraph that assigns no fault also prevents no repetition. So in 2017, as a major at Training Command, she wrote 6 pages. Emergency ascent procedures. Buddy breathing under load. Donor-diver responsibilities at depth with a non-responsive receiver. Ascent rate discipline in the presence of a casualty. The exact, unbearable arithmetic of 9 meters a minute when the person on your regulator is dying. 6 pages, annexed to the program of instruction of the Marine Combatant Diver Course, effective January of 2018. The 6 pages that 22 Marines recited at the water's edge every single morning of that week, in unison, in the flat voice of men reciting something old. The recitation Vollmer led with his hands on his hips, the way a man leads a thing he assumes was handed down from nowhere. At the bottom of page 6, in the footnote, in 8-point type, developed following the loss of Sergeant I. Cormier, USMC. At 23:40, she sent one message to a number Longmire had written on the back of an analyzer tape and left on the seawall. Pull the maintenance tags on every regulator on the wall. Photograph the board with the date stamp. Don't tell anyone you did it. She set the phone face down. The garment bag hung on the back of the door, unopened, 6 days from the 27th. Nobody on that deck had 6 days. 0440. The locker. Vollmer let himself in with his own key and did not turn on the overheads, which was the first mistake, because a man who works in the dark has admitted to himself what he is doing. The regulator rack ran along the north wall. 26 sets, each on its own hook, each with a maintenance tag. Hers hung at the end, third from the corner, drawn out the previous afternoon for the familiarization dive the review board had grudgingly permitted her. One dive, in the shallow tank, under direct supervision. As a formality nobody expected to matter. He took it off the hook. He had a small adjustment tool in his pocket, and he used it on the second stage, the way a man who has serviced 100 regulators uses it. 4 turns on the orifice, cracking the poppet open past its seat, so the demand valve would no longer wait to be asked. On the bench, at the surface, it would breathe. It would even hold pressure for a moment. At depth, with the ambient pressure pushing on a valve that no longer sealed, it would free flow. It would open and stay open, and empty, an aluminum 80 from 3,000 pounds to nothing in a little under 90 seconds, in a roaring column of bubbles, with a woman on the end of it. He hung it back on the hook, tag out, tag straight. In the corner of the ceiling, above the door, there was a camera. It had been there 11 years. It had been there long enough that everyone in that building had stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing a fire extinguisher. It was recording, because it had been recording for 11 years. At 0750 she drew her rig. She did the bench check first, before she touched the harness, before the fins, before anything. Pressurize, purge, breathe, listen, watch the needle. Purge, breathe, listen, watch the needle. 3050. Breathe. 3010. Breathe. 2960. It should have held. On a sealed second stage at the surface, 4 breaths moves the needle a hair. She had watched that needle in that room in 2012 at 27 years old, with Iggy Cormier standing where Longmire was standing now, saying the sentence every combatant diver hears once and never forgets. The bench check is the only part of the dive you get to do twice. 11 seconds. That is how long it took her. She did not shout. She did not turn around and look for him. She reached up to the tag board, took a yellow out-of-service tag, and filled it in with a grease pencil in block capitals. Second stage. Free flow on demand. Detuned. Do not issue. 0751. D. Brannigan. She hung the tag on the regulator and hung the regulator on the board, separate from the rack, on the hook reserved for gear that has been taken out of the fight. Then she took 3 photographs, the tag with the time, the board, and one wider frame that held the regulator, the tag, the board, and the 11-year-old camera in the corner of the ceiling, all in the same shot. Vollmer was on the deck by the tank with his arms folded, and he had been watching the door of the locker for 4 minutes. She came out, and she looked at him across 40 feet of wet concrete, and she smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in 5 days. It was small, and it was not warm, and it went nowhere near her eyes. And every man on that deck who saw it felt something move in the back of his neck without knowing why. "Something funny, Clipboard?" Volmer called. "You used a tool," she said. She walked past him to the bleachers and sat down and opened the laminated clipboard, and Volmer stood there running that sentence through his head and getting a different answer every time. Longmire had come out of the locker behind her. He was looking at a yellow tag with a time on it, in a stranger's handwriting. Then he looked up at the corner of the ceiling, at the camera he had walked under 11,000 times, and his face did something it had not done in 19 years. He went and got the card himself. His hands were not steady, and it was not fear. It was the specific, sick feeling of a professional realizing he had been 3 days late to something that had been happening in his own house. A tagged regulator hung on a board with a time written on it in her handwriting. 11 feet away stood a man who believed paperwork was a weapon, and he had just handed his own to a woman who had spent 5 days collecting it. The board convened at 1000 in classroom 2 because Volmer's report had asked for it. That is the part he never saw coming. He had built the whole thing himself. He had filed the complaint. He had gotten the endorsement. He had pushed it up the chain, and the chain had done exactly what he wanted and convened a proceeding to adjudicate the conduct of a civilian evaluator on his deck. He had summoned every person he needed in one room, 22 students in the back 3 rows, because the detachment commander believed process should be visible. Pelletier at the table, a legal officer from the training command, Longmire against the back wall with a green notebook and a camera card in his shirt pocket, and Brannigan at the end of the table in a dry gray polo with a laminated clipboard. Volmer presented for 11 minutes, and he was good. He walked them through the gas bench, unqualified hand on a student's life support, interruption of an evolution, photography of official logs. He never raised his voice once, which impressed the legal officer, and he used the phrase, "the safety of my Marines," 4 times. Then the legal officer asked if anyone else had anything material. Longmire came off the wall. He did not accuse anyone of anything. He asked a question instead, of the room in the tone of a man asking for the time. "Before we go further," he said, "class. Standard for assent with a non-responsive receiver." 22 Marines recited it. They did it automatically, the way you do a thing you have set at the water's edge every morning for 2 weeks. 9 meters per minute. Donor maintains the airway. Donor controls the ascent. No exceptions for casualty status. Volmer recited it with them. He had said it 1,000 times. His mouth did it without him. Longmire waited for the room to go quiet. Then he held up 6 stapled pages, and he read the cover line. Annex 14, Emergency Ascent and Buddy Breathing Procedures. Program of Instruction, Marine Combatant Diver Course. Effective January 2018. He turned to the last page. Footnote. Developed following the loss of Sergeant I. Cormier, United States Marine Corps. He looked up. Author of record, Major D. Brannigan, United States Marine Corps. Nobody moved. There's a particular silence that happens when 30 people revise their understanding of the last 5 days at the same time. And it does not sound like shock. It sounds like nothing at all. Pelletier put a hand flat on the table. The door opened. Colonel Thaddeus Stedman, 53 years old, commanding officer of the training detachment, came in with a folder in his hand and did not sit down. He had been briefed on the seawall at 0800 by a master diver with a green notebook, and he had spent the 2 hours since making 4 phone calls, and the 4th one had gone to a 2-star at training command, who had said 1 sentence and hung up. Stedman looked at Volmer. Lieutenant Colonel Brannigan takes charge of this course on the 27th, he said. Staff Sergeant, she signs your instructor certification. Vollmer's face went through it in order, and everyone watched it happen. Confusion first, because the sentence contained 2 words that did not belong to the woman at the end of the table. Then disbelief, the small headshake, the beginning of a correction he never got to make. Then recognition, the deck, the shoulder, the 15 feet of water, the laugh, the 22 witnesses, the 4 words she had given him back. Then horror. His hand went out and found the edge of the table and stayed there. Longmire's voice, quiet and enormous. Attention on deck. 22 students came up out of their chairs so fast the second row went over backward. The legal officer stood. Stedman stood. Pelletier stood last and slowest and knew exactly what that said about him and would know it for the rest of his life. Brannigan got to her feet. She returned the salute the room had given her without being told to give it. She let it hold for a beat and a half, then 6 words. As you were. Finish the recitation. They finished it. 22 Marines in a classroom, standing, reciting the last 4 lines of a document written by a major in 2017 about a sergeant who died at 41 feet in 2016. To the woman who had held 9 meters a minute with him on her regulator. She listened to all of it with her hands at her sides. At 11:20, 2 masters-at-arms came in. Tampering with life support equipment is not an administrative matter. It is not a counseling entry, or a page 11, or a bad fitness report. There was a card from an 11-year-old camera showing a man in a dark locker at 0440 with a tool in his hand. There was a yellow out-of-service tag written at 0751 in a handwriting that was now the most credible handwriting in the building. There was a second stage in an evidence bag with its orifice backed out 4 turns. They took him at the door. He did not say anything. He looked back once, at the classroom, at the 22, at the woman standing at the end of the table with her hands at her sides. The regulator went into the bag, and the bag went into a box, and the man who had owned that tank for 6 years was walked past it on his way out, and the water in it did not move at all. It came apart in 9 days, the way these things do once one seam opens. The 2 chamber rides logged as precautionary were both reclassified. One of them had been an omitted decompression treatment on a 19-year-old private who had been sent back down after signaling distress. He had recovered fully. His parents had never been told there was anything to recover from. 9 safety observer signatures came back from the handwriting review as a single hand. The petty officer, whose initials they were, had been on leave for 2 of the dates, and when he was shown the log, he sat down. 3 students washed out in the previous 2 cycles for failure to demonstrate confidence in the aquatic environment, a phrase that appears nowhere in the program of instruction, were recalled. 2 came back. The 3rd had sold his truck and gone home to Ohio and told his father he had quit, and it took a lieutenant colonel 40 minutes on the phone to get him to say yes, and she made that call herself on a Sunday from the seawall. Vollmer's 6 years on that deck went under review in their entirety. Every cycle he had run, every washout he had signed, every log page in his handwriting. Investigators from 2 commands worked in classroom 2 for 11 days with the blinds up, which was deliberate. Stedman wanted the students to walk past it on their way to the water and see what accountability actually looks like when it finally arrives, which is not dramatic. It is 4 people at a table with boxes. The unlogged night evolutions came out in the first 48 hours because 11 Marines had been in the water for 94 minutes on a Tuesday that did not exist on any schedule, and 11 Marines all remembered it the same way. Pelletier was relieved for cause on the 4th day and took his 14 years quietly. He did not argue, and he did not ask her for anything, which was the only dignified thing he did in the entire story. He stopped her once in the corridor outside the chamber bay and started a sentence about his daughter. She stopped it with one line. "You had 14 years to say one word, Gunny. You needed one." And a motto. Amato handed over his phone with the group chat still open on the screen at 0940 on the morning of the board. An hour before it convened, before he knew who she was, before there was anything in it for him, he scrolled it to the top himself and handed it over, and said, "It's all in there, and most of it's mine." He finished the course. He was not the strongest diver in the class, and he never became one. But on the last night, on a knot-tying evolution with the proper 4 safety swimmers in the water, and the lights on and the schedule published, he stayed down twice as long as he had to, in the dark, tying and untying, until his hands knew it without him. On graduation morning, she pinned him as leading diver of the class, and he could not look at her. "Look at me, Amato." He did, eventually. "You went first," she said, "before you knew who I was, before it could help you. That's the whole job. That is the entire job." If this is the part where your chest went tight, that's the point of these stories. There are people right now standing quietly in rooms where everyone has decided who they are, waiting for the day the truth arrives on its own. Subscribe to Honor Tales and stay for the ones still coming. She kept her mouth shut for 5 days so that when she opened it, it would be the last word anyone needed. On the 27th, the garment bag came off the back of the door. The service uniform, the gold oak leaves, the ribbon rack with the Combat V second from the top, which nobody on that deck had ever seen, and which she did not explain. The change of charge took 90 seconds. She read the orders. She took the course. She looked at 71 Marines and sailors standing in ranks on a concrete deck at 0800 and said 4 words. "Get in the water." That evening, dusk, the deck was empty and hosed down. The underwater lights were on, and the tank was a rectangle of green in a dark room, and the surface was so still it looked solid. She sat on the edge with her feet in it. First time in 23 days she had touched that water, because she chose to. She thought about 41 feet, about 9 meters a minute, about a man who taught her to tuck the tail of a hose in that same locker 14 years ago, because a hose that walks off a bench finds a boot at exactly the wrong moment. The footnote was still on page 6. It would be on page 6 in 20 years, in a document recited every morning by men who would never know whose sentences they were saying. That was, she had decided a long time ago, the correct amount of memorial. When she went up to the office at 2100, there was a dive slate propped against her door. An ordinary white plastic slate with a grease pencil on a lanyard, the kind hanging in every dive locker in the world. On it, in block capitals, in a hand she had not seen in 7 years. "Sea Glass still owes you a beer. Sulu, Sea, come collect." Underneath the slate, a photograph, a bottom timer on a wrist, stopped at 41 feet. She read it twice. She folded the photograph into her breast pocket and picked up the slate and stood in the dark corridor for a while. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.